We're now going to take a quick look at some of the new xStream integrated features, and everything you're seeing within Cinema 4D will be available within your host application, with the exception of Lightwave, which does not support icons or the ecosystem painter. And please excuse this scene, it's not completely finished. It's still in sort of a previs version. Take a look. You can see, for the most part, it's unfinished. I'm going to go back to the full quality view where we can see the light, and I've already have a view scene loaded in with just a maple tree to the side of the building. And at the moment I don't have any global illumination or radiosity set up, so we can see all the shadows are really dark. And I'm using a very low quality anti-aliasing just to get a quicker render. So first what I'm going to do is just turn on Cinema 4D's global illumination. And looking at this render, right now pretty much all the objects are host application objects, so the shadows all look correct. If I just select the ground plane, and I'm going to go ahead and move that up just above the other object I have, just so we can see a shadow on a view object. With the tree casting on it, we're going to see it much darker. But I am technically in the global ambience mode, so we're not going to see it completely black. If I go ahead and set this up, going to the atmosphere editor and modifying the sunlight so that there's no ambient illumination from view, and we can take a look. You can see the shadows overall are a lot darker, and that's throughout all the objects. And this already is an improvement, because in previous versions, this overall blend would require better settings within view. So if we change this over to just the standard mode to take a look, so just the standard lighting model, everything for the most part is rendering pretty good except the view shadows and diffuse lighting. So in this case, if we set it back to our 50-50 blend, which is the default, the lighting balance ends up okay. I mean, it needs some more adjustments, but for the most part it's actually working out pretty good. If we move this over to radiosity, then we're going to be able to start taking a look at some of these new features. Besides some of the obvious ones, which I'll point out in just a minute. But you can see in the render that we have just overall a much better shadow and lighting system between the two applications. It ends up working out to a huge advantage compared to in version 7. Now I do want to point out some of the new features. One thing you may notice is if you're looking at the commands for view, also looking at the plugin itself when it loads, it's going to be called View 7 and not View 8. This is for the backwards compatibility. Even in Cinema, if we take a look at the command manager, and I'll just go ahead and sort this by plugin, we're going to see everything is called View 7, even though I'm running View 8. This is because, if you take a look in the view options, there's now a core version availability. Now, what you can do is set up a couple of different scenarios. You can choose to use the highest core version on the system, the version that was used to create the original scene, or you can force all loaded scenes to go to a specific version. On my system, I've got 7, 7.5, and 8 installed, so these are my available core versions I can choose from. So that's pretty cool. If you have any issues with certain things not working in the new version, that way you can go to the core version, set it up the way you want to run it. Personally, I've been using the force option, and if the scene needs to be loaded in another version, I just reset the core version, reload the scene, rather than having it be automatic, which can sometimes cause problems, not always. One thing you may notice as of version 7.5, the ability to adjust the infinite procedural terrain geometry size, infinite plane geometry size, depending on which application you're using, these may or may not have been available within version 7. A new scene options is available, and this is for using spherical scenes and planetary terrains directly within your host application. Now, because of the way the units are modified, it's not necessarily going to show up the same way it does within the standalone version. So that's one thing to keep in mind, but you can adjust the primary settings of a spherical scene directly from the options panel. We can also go to the render options, now just a tab, quicker to access, and we have a lot more control over final gathering, which you'll notice on the bottom. We have the ability to disconnect GI radiosity lighting from either application, whether from view, what's in the view scene, or within the host application scene, and also to adjust the scale and or intensity of that final gather output. So I'm going to change views really quick to 10. And now what we can see happening is that the view objects are being affected 10 times more than they were before from the host application objects. So the light that we see on the ground and all the sampling, and keep in mind I do have really low quality settings on right now, so it is a little distorted. But we can see that really bright contrast. So this allows you to really fine-tune the lighting beyond going into the atmosphere and modifying the scene and having to make huge amounts of changes in order to get it to match up correctly or look right. Also, it eliminates any sort of compositing you would have to do specifically for that reason. So if we were to go ahead and reverse that, let's do 1 for the view scale and 10 for the host scale, you can see obviously a huge difference. Now in this case it's going to multiply a lot more, and it will depend somewhat on the way you have your scale set up between the applications. This building is not to scale. I went in and set up a manual unit just to get it kind of close to it. So it's not necessarily going to be exactly the same. I'll go ahead and set it to 2. So although it's still really bright, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm just using a really basic material on this object. Actually, in this case, there is no material on it whatsoever. The only materials I currently have are just the view materials as part of the environment. So if we go back, now we could also scale this down. So if I wanted it to be 0.2, you can see the GI lighting, a huge decrease. So the ability to go back and forth like this is just a really great enhancement to the application. So I'm going to go back and set this to the default values. We can also disconnect those final gathers. So let's disconnect view. And now what we can see is the samples within and on the view objects aren't really receiving light from the cinema objects. And then you can go the other way around too. And actually, it looks like I did have that backwards, but you get the idea. It's still pretty straightforward. So I also want to show, just really quick, turning off global illumination and just having View's radiosity on. And in the case of cinema, unless you're using global illumination, you will have to fake the ambient lighting or use another means of light in order to pick up the lighting within those diffused areas. So we'll just make sure we can go ahead and turn that back on. And obviously what you can see is a set of icons. Every single application has icons that can be loaded in, with, like I was saying before, the exception to Lightwave, which you'll have to load in the interface panels and add and import the branch tree in order to get the commands to show up, which will be as text. Now, another large improvement to compatible applications is to the xStream Painter. Once again, not available within Lightwave. Now, if you take a look at the pull-down menu, the xStream Painter will still be available. This is for when you're using the core version compatibility with a previous version, mainly version 7 and 7.5, where the process was different. You would select the to paint an ecosystem and then the xStream Painter and the proxy panel. You would have to close it out and then you could paint. So the largest change is that you now just can directly select Paint Ecosystem, which I have right here. And that's going to immediately pull up the painter without having to set it up ahead of time, start the process, stop the process. So I'm just going to add in a couple of instances to the ecosystem population. So I just have 2 shrubs from the asileFX shrub collection, and starting with a single instance mode, I'm going to go ahead and click and paint, and we can see that this is a little too large, so I'm going to go ahead and clear it out and set the scale to, I'd say, 0.15, and that should be good. Let's go ahead and switch to the brush mode. And I'm just going to paint a little along the bottom of the entire building, and in this case, even on the building. And that way we've got a little bit more in the scene. It'll look a little more interesting. So obviously the biggest change, we can now leave the Ecosystem Painter or xStream Painter open without having to close it out when we want to paint. So the workflow there is just like using it in standalone. There's no need to start it, stop it, unless you're using the core version change and you're back in version 7 or 7.5. Then you will need to perform the operation the same way as you did before, where you would select File or Edit, Paint Ecosystem, and then select the xStream Painter. And then there's a start and stop operation, and you can open the panel. But you can't have the panel open in version 7 and 7.5 while you're painting, so that's a nice big change. So we can see all of those objects showing up. And for cinema users, there was an issue in version 7 where the view plants may not have been influencing, or at least view objects and their color weren't influencing the final gather of global illumination onto the cinema objects. So they do now without any intense setup, which is pretty nice. And here's a quick render, low quality settings with cinema's ambient occlusion on along with the global illumination. If you're not familiar with the way it's set up, within cinema, the ambient occlusion and global illumination do run as separate processes. For view users, in view, ambient occlusion rate is included and part of the radiosity, but you can also just run the ambient occlusion if needed. And this is a render of just view set to global ambience, and there is no influence of the color of the view scene on the cinema objects or the host application objects. So that's just in the atmosphere editor, global ambience. Switch that back to radiosity. I'll go ahead and turn up the sunlight a little, and I'm also going to go ahead and adjust the sun's position. And we can see something a little more from the front. What I'm going to do is change the material on the ground plane. So we just select the ground, and I have my right-click set up to access some of the commands from View 8. My View 7 setup was basically the same, even with icons, just using a scripting setup to assign to the commands. One nice thing is now, with the panel, at least in Cinema, you can just pull out the direct command without having to set up any sort of scripts. We can see these are my user scripts from View 7 that I had to set up in order to get the icons to work. So I'll just go ahead and change the object material. I'm going to load in one of my grass materials. And I'm also going to modify that sun a little. So switch the rotate command, and I just want to probably go and set the coordinates so I can find the sun. And also by default, one change that was made that I made a suggestion for was to make by default the point at camera option turned off within xStream, because otherwise when you would move the camera around, the sun would move with it unless you turned the command off. So that was kind of a big pain. Although in this case it does look like the rotation of the sun itself is possibly off a little. One note to make is that if you take a look at the pitch, and I'm not sure how it is in other applications, but in Cinema, if we take a look at the pitch, it's negative 29, which is reversed from the actual pitch amount. Or if you can see 29.29, and then the heading is slightly offset, so that's just one thing to keep in mind. But I'm just going to make a slight modification to the light. And you can really see that green showing up on the objects now, very intense. And because the lighting balance is set differently, we have a lot more towards sunlight. That increases the highlights that you'll see and also the depth of the bump. If you need to modify the shadow of the sunlight, you can edit the object's properties. And we can see that that point at camera option is not on. And then we can add or go ahead and edit shadows. This way we can set up our shadow maps. If you wanted to use shadow maps instead of the normal ray tracing. But in this case what we could do is just turn down the shadow density. And that way if we still want to have that higher sunlight amount, the shadows won't be so dark. So that's a nice big difference that we can see changing that. And now if I wanted to adjust the shadows directly within the host app, in this case Cinema, that would be directly within the host light and modifying its settings. In this case, we're going to see that density has updated, and that's because of the improvements to the lights as well. Now, in version 7, the shadow density wouldn't update, and those would remain separate. Now there's a new option. If we go to File and Options, and under the General tab, there's a Light Options. And if we click Edit, what we're going to see is any native lights in the scene. And right now, I don't have any cinema lights, so the list is completely empty. If we go to the view lights, we're going to see all the lights that are currently in view. Now, because the sun is the main primary light, we don't really have access to manually modify some of these settings. So I'm going to create a little bit of a different lighting setup so that you can see this option a little better. So we'll go ahead and just modify this light and pretty much make it so we're in shadow. So now the scene's basically just indirect light. Probably need to turn down the intensity on the ambient occlusion settings. But what I'm going to do is create a couple of lights. And I'm going to start with creating a point light. And this is going to be a cinema point light. So host application light. And we're going to go into those options. And now we can see under the native lights that we have that light selected or in the list. And by default, it's going to be set to the automatic mode. We can set it to ignore, so it won't create a view light. In other words, it won't have any influence on view scenery. The other option is to manually edit that light. So if we wanted to set up any special parameters. So let's take a look first at just the automatic settings. And I am going to modify some of the properties. I'm going to go ahead and change the color to make it a slight blue tint. And also set up shadow ray traced. Now, because of the way the units are set up, the intensity of the light isn't bright enough to influence the view scene. However, it's more than bright enough to influence the host application and the cinema objects. So in this case, because I did set up my own custom unit system, and you might have to customize it anyway, we can go over to the conversion and select to manually edit the view light parameters. This way we can set the power, and as we can see, the power is set to 8.3. Well, that's really, really low, and that's not nearly enough to influence the view scene. So what we can do is modify this power, and I'm going to go ahead and set this up to a value of 800. So now we have new values specific to the view objects from the cinema objects. And now we can see the influence on the view scene. So sometimes it takes a little bit of an adjustment. And there was such a huge change between version 6 of xStream and version 7, where the lighting setup was just not as good as it was in version 6, because duplicate lighting wasn't always created or matched correctly. So now having this light panel really opens up the options where you don't have to use View Sync, which is the plugin available for Infinite users standalone, where you can import or synchronize cameras and lights back and forth between applications. And now the only thing that would really need to be modified with this is we're going to go back into that panel, edit the light, and as we can see, the color did match up properly, which is good. If we wanted to create some sort of volumetric light, then we're going to need to separately create a volumetric light within View and a volumetric light within Cinema. For the most part, you'd want to use host application volumetric lighting. It tends to work a little bit better, or at least it looks a lot cleaner. You might have to play around with some of the settings in order to get the shadows to work correctly, but for the most part, your host application probably has a better volumetric lighting system, or at least a faster rendering one. We're now going to take a look at just one last thing, and that is terrains and their geometry. Geometry has been greatly increased for the previews and the proxy objects compared to in version 7, where they could have been fairly minimal and sometimes unpredictable. Now, looking at this, you may notice a huge difference between certain areas of the proxy. That's because when it's generated, it's dependent on the camera's position. It will have a very high quality near the camera, and then as you move away, the quality of the object drops. And you can still adjust the overall geometry quality to change that preview geometry. But this is linked to the camera position. And if we edit the object, and I'm just going to go ahead and reduce and then increase the resolution just to trigger that there's a change. And now that the camera's moved, we can see the proxy geometry has been updated. So if you need to refresh the geometry, all you need to do is just go to edit the object, and you might not even have to trigger anything. I'm going to go ahead and edit the object, click OK, and we can see it does update without any sort of trigger. So if you need to in your application to get it to update properly, just make a slight change that won't really impact the terrain. In the case of a procedural terrain, you can typically just change the scale and then change it back. That will work pretty well. If not, maybe a tiny bit of painting, but for the most part, works pretty well. And specific to cinema users, I did have one thing changed, and that is the reversal of the normal direction on the proxy objects. In version 7, all proxy objects had the normals facing the wrong way. So if you want to use the backface culling, now everything will show up correctly, where before it would have been basically invisible. This also makes it a lot easier if you want to use the proxies to interact with any of the dynamic systems, maybe acting as like a collision. This way you don't need to perform a reverse normal operation, although you'll still need to possibly create a connect object, at least in Cinema, in order to join all the points together and optimize it. And in that case, you'd want to copy the terrain, paste it, and then edit the object. Because if we take a look at the object information, it shows 0 points and 0 polygons, and then in parentheses, it shows 2 objects, one for the entire zone, one for the main terrain, and then all of the proxy geometry, which isn't actually part of the scene. And there was one other thing I was able to get changed, and that is, or basically fixed. If you go to the Atmosphere Editor and you go to Add a Cloud, In version 7, it would set kind of a default amount for altitude and height. It wasn't correct. And now the values are going to be what they're supposed to be. So instead of being an altitude of 50, a height of 200, which was basically added for pretty much every cloud, because the scales were off slightly. So as you can see, 164, 228, altitude 164, height 228. We added in, it's going to show up correctly. So before, what you had to do in order to get the correct cloud layer to show up with the right scale, when you were loading it in, you had to go into the standalone version. Well, now you don't have to worry about that. So that's a nice big improvement. That was one thing that really annoyed me, so I made sure I reported it and got it taken care of. So besides bug fixes and some stability improvements, those are the main integration changes. And if you're a Cinema 4D user and you haven't yet upgraded to version 11.5, do want to let you know that the rendering speed is vastly increased, and interactions between the two programs is just a huge bonus. And the overall stability is really quite good. And just one more note to Cinema users, and that is, now in version 7, when you went to modify a proxy, you would have to be in the object mode. There's a possibility that it will work in the model mode. In this case, it looks like it is locked, but if it does work while you're in the modeling mode, make sure you undo that action or save your scene right away, because it will potentially crash the application if you're able to move it. It looks like they've, for the most part, fixed that, so it shouldn't be a problem. But if you do run into being in the modeling manipulator and the view proxies do change, make sure you get out of that right away, because it's probably going to cause some problems.